Imagine a warrior so honorable that even his enemies called him noble. A Muslim sultan so merciful that Christian chroniclers struggled to demonize him. A conqueror who reclaimed Jerusalem not with massacre, but with restraint that shocked the medieval world. His name was Saladin, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. The man who united a fractured Islamic world, defeated the greatest Crusader army ever assembled, and became a legend in both East and West. But who was he really? A holy warrior driven by faith? A cunning politician who wielded honor as a weapon? Or simply a man thrust into history's crucible who chose a different path than everyone expected? If you enjoy epic true stories that change the world, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It really helps the channel grow. This is the story of how one man transformed the Middle Ages, not just through victory, but through the radical idea that mercy could be more powerful than revenge. To understand Saladin, you must first understand the world he was born into, a world torn apart by religious war, where every city was a battlefield and every treaty was temporary. The year was 1138. The First Crusade had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations. In 1099, European knights had captured Jerusalem, slaughtering thousands of Muslims and Jews in what they considered a holy victory. They established Crusader kingdoms along the eastern Mediterranean coast, fragile Christian states carved into the heart of the Islamic world. For nearly a century, this situation festered. The Crusader states, Jerusalem, Antioch, Tripoli, Edessa, survived through fortifications, internal divisions among Muslims, and continuous reinforcement from Europe. They were islands of Christianity in a sea of Islam, sustained by faith, fear, and the constant arrival of new crusaders seeking glory and salvation. But the Islamic world was changing. The initial shock of the Crusader invasion had given way to a slow, grinding determination to reclaim what had been lost. Leaders arose who promised unity, who called for jihad not as conquest but as liberation. The problem was that the Muslim world itself was fractured. Sunni fighting Shia, Turkish dynasties competing with Arab rulers, local emirs more concerned with their own power than collective resistance. Jerusalem stood at the center of this maelstrom. To Christians, it was the city where Christ died and rose again, the holiest site in Christendom. To Muslims, it was Al-Quds, the third holiest city in Islam, the place from which Muhammad ascended to heaven. To Jews, it was the eternal capital, the site of Solomon's temple, the heart of ancient Israel. Three faiths, one city, and an ocean of blood already spilled over it. Into this world of competing empires, religious zealotry, and endless warfare, a Kurdish boy was born in Tikrit in what is now Iraq. His father, Najm ad-Din Ayyub, was a minor military commander in the service of various Muslim rulers. The family had position but not great wealth or power. They were part of the military aristocracy that held the Islamic world together, professional soldiers and administrators who served whoever paid them. Young Salah ad-Din, his name meant righteousness of the faith, showed little early promise of greatness. He was studious, interested in religion and law more than warfare. His uncle Shirkuh was the military genius of the family, a powerful general serving the Turkish ruler Nur ad-Din, who controlled Syria and dreamed of uniting the Muslim world against the Crusaders. Saladin's path to power began almost accidentally. In 1164, his uncle Shirkuh led a military expedition to Egypt, and Saladin, then in his mid-20s, reluctantly accompanied him. Egypt was the great prize of the medieval Middle East. Wealthy, populous, strategically vital. Whoever controlled Egypt could challenge the Crusaders effectively. But Egypt was a mess. The Fatimid Caliphate that ruled it was collapsing from within, torn by palace intrigues, incompetent rulers, and economic decline. Both the Crusaders and the Syrian Muslims saw an opportunity. Shirkuh and Saladin found themselves in a complex three-way power struggle. The dying Fatimid regime, the ambitious Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, and their own Turkish lord Nur ad-Din trying to gain influence. It was in this crucible of Byzantine politics and military maneuvering that Saladin learned the arts of war and statecraft. Stay until the end, because what Saladin accomplished, and what nearly destroyed him, would echo through 8 centuries and counting. Saladin's first taste of real command came in circumstances he never wanted. In 1167, during the Second Egyptian expedition, his uncle Shirkuh's forces found themselves trapped in Alexandria, besieged by a combined Crusader Egyptian army. Shirkuh needed someone to hold Alexandria while he broke out to seek reinforcements. He chose Saladin, who was barely 30 years old and had never commanded a siege defense. For 75 days, Saladin held that city. The Crusaders bombarded the walls. Supplies dwindled. Disease spread through the garrison. His own men grumbled about this bookish commander who quoted poetry and Islamic law when they wanted aggressive action. But Saladin discovered something about himself during that siege. He could lead. He maintained discipline when morale collapsed. He rationed supplies fairly. He personally walked the walls under arrow fire, showing his troops he shared their danger. When relief finally came and the siege was lifted, Saladin had earned his first military reputation, not for brilliant tactics but for stubborn endurance. The Third Egyptian Campaign in 1169 changed everything. Shirkuh finally succeeded in becoming vizier, the chief minister, of Egypt. But he was old, exhausted from years of campaigning. Within 2 months of achieving his life's ambition, Shirkuh died suddenly, probably from a heart attack. The Fatimid Caliph and his court faced a dilemma. They needed a strong military leader to maintain order and resist Crusader pressure. But they didn't want someone so powerful he'd threaten their own position. Saladin seemed perfect. Young, unproven, scholarly rather than warrior-like. They thought they could control him. They were catastrophically wrong. Saladin accepted the position of vizier at age 31. He immediately began consolidating power with a patience and cunning no one expected. He brought in Kurdish and Turkish troops loyal to him personally. He cultivated the religious establishment, presenting himself as a pious reformer fighting Fatimid Shia corruption, while championing Sunni orthodoxy. But he faced immediate threats. The Fatimid court didn't trust him. He was an outsider, a Sunni in a Shia regime, a young upstart surrounded by veteran politicians who'd survived decades of palace intrigue. Some plotted to assassinate him. Others conspired with the Crusaders to have him removed. Saladin moved carefully but ruthlessly. When a plot against him was discovered in 1169, he had the conspirators executed. When the Fatimid Caliph's chief of the Black African Palace Guard rebelled with 50,000 supporters, Saladin put down the rebellion with extreme violence, burning parts of Cairo in the process. Each threat he survived taught him new lessons in political survival. He learned when to show mercy and when to show steel. He learned to maintain networks of spies and informants. He learned that power required not just military strength but legitimacy, not just force but the appearance of religious righteousness. In 1171, when the Fatimid Caliph Al-Adid died, Saladin made his boldest move. Instead of recognizing a new Fatimid Caliph, which would have maintained the Shia dynasty that had ruled Egypt for 2 centuries, he declared allegiance to the Sunni Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. With one stroke, he ended a 200-year-old dynasty and positioned himself as champion of Sunni orthodoxy across the Islamic world. It was brilliant, calculated, and gave him religious legitimacy that transcended Egypt. But his patron Nur ad-Din in Syria was watching with growing alarm. His servant had become too powerful, too independent. By 1174, war between them seemed inevitable. Nur ad-Din began assembling an army to march on Egypt and remind Saladin who was master. And then, with timing so convenient some historians still suspect foul play, Nur ad-Din died. Suddenly, unexpectedly, at 57, Syria was left without a strong ruler. Nur ad-Din's heir was an 11-year-old boy. The unified Muslim resistance Nur ad-Din had built began fragmenting immediately. Saladin saw his moment. He marched north from Egypt, claiming to be protecting Nur ad-Din's son and maintaining Muslim unity against the Crusaders. In reality, he was conquering. Damascus opened its gates to him in October 1174. The city's leaders calculated that Saladin offered stability and protection the child caliph couldn't provide. Aleppo resisted, but after a long siege it too fell. City by city, fortress by fortress, Saladin brought Syria under his control. But this wasn't just military conquest. Saladin understood that power required legitimacy. He married Nur ad-Din's widow, creating a dynastic link. He presented himself as the faithful servant continuing his master's work. He built madrasas, religious schools, to train scholars loyal to his vision. He endowed mosques and charitable institutions. He lived modestly, distributed plunder generously, and cultivated a reputation for piety and justice that made his rule seem not just powerful but righteous. Do you think great leaders are born, or made by history? Drop your answer in the comments, because Saladin's story suggests that sometimes ordinary people are thrust into extraordinary circumstances and discover capabilities they never knew they possessed. By 1183, Saladin controlled Egypt, Syria, and was extending his reach into northern Mesopotamia. The Crusader states, which had survived by exploiting Muslim disunity, now faced something unprecedented: a coordinated, well-funded, religiously motivated enemy with the resources to sustain long campaigns. But Saladin's rise hadn't been unopposed by fellow Muslims. The Zengid dynasty that had once employed him fought to maintain their independence. The emirs of Mosul resisted his expansion. And lurking in the mountains was a threat unlike any other: the assassins. While Christian chroniclers portrayed Saladin as the united leader of Islam, the reality was far more complicated. His greatest struggles weren't always against Crusaders. They were against fellow Muslims who saw him as a power-hungry usurper. The most dangerous were the Nizari Ismailis, better known to history as the Assassins. This Shia sect, operating from mountain fortresses across Syria and Persia, specialized in political murder. They killed caliphs, viziers, and generals. They viewed Saladin's Sunni orthodoxy as heresy and his growing power as a threat. In 1175, Saladin laid siege to Aleppo, trying to complete his conquest of Syria. His camp was well guarded, his movements carefully protected. But the assassins had infiltrated his army. One night, a group of them attacked his tent. They disguised themselves as his own guards. Saladin woke to find armed men standing over his bed. What saved him was equal parts luck and paranoia. He'd been sleeping in his armor, a habit developed from years of campaigning in hostile territory. The assassin's knives couldn't penetrate the mail. His actual guards heard the commotion and rushed in. The assassins were killed, but it was terrifyingly close. Saladin's response revealed his strategic mind. He could have launched a massive military campaign against the assassin strongholds, but they were nearly impregnable mountain fortresses. Instead, he negotiated. He reached an understanding with the assassins' leader, Rashid ad-Din Sinan, the legendary Old Man of the Mountain. The exact terms remain mysterious, but the assassination attempt stopped. Meanwhile, other Muslim rulers resented Saladin's expansion. The Zengid emirs of Mosul and Aleppo had their own claims to leadership. They argued that Saladin was spending Muslim blood fighting other Muslims when he should be focusing on the Crusaders. They weren't entirely wrong. Between 1174 and 1186, Saladin spent as much time fighting fellow Muslims as he did fighting Crusaders. The siege of Aleppo in 1183 was particularly brutal. This was a Muslim city resisting a Muslim conqueror. Thousands died. Families were torn apart. The moral complexity was profound. Saladin's justification was always the same. Unity was necessary before Islam could effectively resist the Crusaders. A fractured Muslim world would always lose to a coordinated Christian enemy. Therefore, he argued, his conquests of Muslim territories were necessary steps toward the ultimate goal of liberating Jerusalem. But this reasoning didn't satisfy everyone. Religious scholars questioned whether his wars against fellow Muslims were legitimate jihad. Some emirs fought him not from ambition but from genuine belief that he was causing fitna, internal strife, within the Muslim community. Saladin addressed these criticisms through a combination of force and persuasion. He brought prominent religious scholars into his court, securing fatwas that legitimized his actions. He framed every conquest as necessary for the greater good. And he demonstrated repeatedly that resistance was futile. He would win eventually, so cooperation was wiser than opposition. His brother Al-Adil proved crucial during this period. Where Saladin was sometimes too generous, too trusting, Al-Adil was pragmatic and ruthless. He handled the dirty work of politics, The bribes, the threats, the necessary betrayals. Together they made a formidable team. By 1186, Saladin had achieved what no one else had in generations. He controlled a unified territory stretching from Egypt through Syria to Mesopotamia. The Crusader states were surrounded. But unifying this empire had cost him. His treasury was depleted from constant warfare. His emirs were exhausted. Many wanted peace, consolidation, rest. They'd won enough, they argued. Why risk everything on another war? Saladin needed a justification to mobilize this reluctant coalition for the great campaign he envisioned. He needed an enemy so threatening, so offensive, that even war-weary Muslims would rally to fight. That enemy's name was Reynald of Chatillon, and he would give Saladin exactly what he needed. Before we can understand Saladin's greatest victory, we need to understand his most humiliating defeat, and the remarkable young king who inflicted it. Baldwin IV became king of Jerusalem at 13 years old. He was already showing symptoms of leprosy, a disease that would slowly destroy his body over the next decade. Medieval medicine could do nothing for him. He knew he was dying. The only question was how long he had. But Baldwin IV refused to be a figurehead. Despite his disease, despite his youth, he was determined to be a real king. And in November 1177 he proved it. Saladin had invaded the kingdom of Jerusalem with a massive army, perhaps 26,000 men. He'd left the main Crusader force behind, besieging a castle far to the north. Jerusalem itself was nearly defenseless. Saladin split his forces, sending raiding parties across the countryside while he marched toward the holy city with the main army. It seemed like a masterstroke. But Saladin had made a crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the dying boy on Jerusalem's throne. Baldwin IV, against all advice, gathered every available knight, probably fewer than 500 men, and marched to intercept Saladin. It was suicide. Everyone knew it. A few hundred knights against 20,000 battle-hardened warriors. They met at a place called Montgassard, near the coastal town of Ramla. Saladin's army was dispersed, overconfident, not expecting serious resistance. His forces were spread across the countryside, looting and raiding. When Baldwin's small force appeared, Saladin initially dismissed them as a minor nuisance. That dismissal nearly cost him his life. Baldwin, despite his disease ravaging his body, personally led the charge. The small Crusader force smashed into Saladin's center with the fury of desperation. The Templars, elite warrior monks who formed Baldwin's core force, fought like men possessed. Saladin's forces, caught unprepared and scattered, broke. What should have been an easy victory turned into catastrophic defeat. Thousands of Saladin's soldiers were killed. The rest fled in panic. Saladin himself barely escaped, reportedly fleeing on a racing camel with only a handful of guards. It was the worst defeat of his military career. The invincible unifier of Islam had been humiliated by a teenage leper and a few hundred knights. The sources, Muslim and Christian alike, describe Saladin's reaction. He was devastated. Not just by the military loss, though that was severe enough, but by the humiliation. By the proof that he wasn't invincible. By the demonstration that courage and faith could overcome numerical superiority. Montgassard changed Saladin. He became more cautious, more methodical. He stopped taking unnecessary risks. He learned to respect the Crusaders' fighting capabilities, particularly the military orders whose fanatical discipline made them dangerous even when outnumbered. And he developed a strange respect for Baldwin IV. Here was a young man who, by all rights, should have been dead or at least bedridden. Instead, he was leading armies, making strategic decisions, refusing to let his disease define his reign. Over the next few years, Saladin and Baldwin fought a series of campaigns, raids, sieges, skirmishes. Baldwin won some, Saladin won others. They developed the relationship warriors sometimes develop, enemies who respected each other's capabilities. In 1183, Saladin besieged Carrick Castle during a royal wedding. Baldwin IV, his body now so ravaged by leprosy that he could barely ride, had himself carried on a litter to relieve the siege. Saladin withdrew rather than risk another confrontation. When Baldwin IV finally died in 1185, Blind, unable to use his hands, his body literally falling apart from disease. He was just 24 years old. He'd reigned for 11 years, most of them spent dying, all of them spent fighting. His death removed the one Crusader leader Saladin genuinely feared. Baldwin's successors were incompetent, fractious, politically naive. The kingdom descended into civil war between rival factions. For Saladin, this was the opportunity he'd been waiting for. The strong king was dead. The kingdom was divided. All he needed was a spark to justify full-scale war. That spark came from the most reckless, violent, treaty-breaking lord in the Crusader states, Reynold of Chatillon. Reynold was everything the worst stereotypes said about Crusaders. Brutal, treacherous, motivated more by greed than faith. He'd attacked Muslim pilgrims repeatedly, violating truces. He'd raided caravans, including one reportedly carrying Saladin's sister. He'd even threatened to attack Mecca and Medina themselves, the holiest cities in Islam. For Saladin, Reynold was perfect. Here was an enemy so obviously villainous that even war-weary Muslims would rally against him. Here was a justification for jihad that no one could question. In 1187, Reynold attacked another caravan, killing Muslims who were traveling under an official truce. It was the final provocation. Saladin declared war. Not a border raid or limited campaign. Total war. The liberation of Jerusalem. The destruction of the Crusader states. If this story is changing how you see the Crusades, make sure you're subscribed for more episodes like this. He assembled the largest army of his career. Estimates range from 20 to 30,000 men. Kurdish cavalry from his homeland. Turkish horse archers. Egyptian infantry. Syrian Mamluks. Warriors from across the Muslim world, united by faith and the promise of victory. The Crusaders, recognizing the threat, assembled their own army, virtually every available knight and soldier from the kingdom. Perhaps 20,000 men, including the elite Templars and Hospitallers. The two forces maneuvered across the landscape of Palestine, each seeking advantage. And then, in early July 1187, Saladin executed the trap that would decide the fate of the Crusader kingdoms. The campaign that led to Hattin was a masterclass in strategic manipulation. Saladin besieged the city of Tiberias, knowing the Crusaders couldn't ignore the threat. But Tiberias was a trap. It sat near the Sea of Galilee with water on one side and dry, waterless terrain on the other. King Guy of Jerusalem faced an impossible choice. If he marched to relieve Tiberias, he'd have to cross that waterless terrain in the brutal July heat. If he didn't march, he'd look weak, abandoning Christian territory to the Muslims. Guy's council was divided. Raymond of Tripoli, whose own wife was trapped in Tiberias, argued for caution. The terrain favored Saladin. They should wait, force Saladin to come to them, fight from defensive positions near water. But other voices, particularly the Grand Master of the Templars and Reynold of Chatillon, argued for immediate action. Cowardice they called caution. Abandoning fellow Christians to Muslim conquest. Guy, weak-willed and easily influenced, chose to march. It was exactly what Saladin wanted. The Crusader army left the springs at Sephoria on July 3rd. They marched through rising heat, carrying heavy armor, desperately rationing water. Saladin's cavalry harassed them constantly, arrows falling like rain, hit-and-run attacks, preventing any group from breaking away to find water. By evening, the Crusaders had covered less than 20 miles but were already in desperate condition. They'd reached a plateau near a hill called the Horns of Hattin, a double-peaked formation visible for miles. Water was still miles away. Guy wanted to push through the night to reach the Sea of Galilee. But his infantry couldn't continue. They collapsed where they stood, begging for water that didn't exist. The Crusader army camped on that waterless plateau. Around them, in a vast semicircle, Saladin's forces settled in for the night. They had water. They had supplies. They had fresh warriors rotating in to replace tired ones. The Crusaders had nothing but thirst and the knowledge that morning would bring hell. Saladin's troops set fire to the dry grass. Smoke added to the torment. All night, the Christians suffered thirst, heat, fear, and the psychological torture of knowing they'd been outmaneuvered. At dawn on July 4, 1187, Saladin attacked. The Crusader infantry broke first. Maddened by thirst, they fled toward the horns of Hattin, hoping the high ground offered salvation. Saladin's forces surrounded them. They surrendered en masse, thousands of men laying down their arms, too exhausted and dehydrated to fight. The knights attempted to charge, but their horses were as spent as the men. They managed a few desperate assaults but couldn't break through. One by one, the great nobles of the kingdom were captured or killed. Raymond of Tripoli, leading the vanguard, managed to break through Saladin's lines in the initial chaos and escaped. He would survive but would die of grief within months, blaming himself for the disaster. King Guy fought until his horse was killed under him. He was captured, along with the relic of the true cross, supposedly a fragment of the cross on which Christ died, the most sacred object the Crusaders possessed. By noon it was over. The greatest Crusader army ever assembled in the East had been annihilated. Perhaps 15,000 men killed or captured. The military elite of the kingdom, gone in a single morning. Saladin ordered his tent erected on the battlefield. The captured nobles were brought before him, exhausted, defeated, waiting to learn their fate. He offered water to King Guy, a gesture of mercy in Arab culture that guaranteed the king's safety. Guy drank desperately, then passed the cup to Reynald of Chatillon. Saladin reached out and stopped the cup before Reynald could drink. "You did not have my permission to drink," he said. The meaning was clear. The mercy extended to Guy did not extend to Reynald. Saladin reminded Reynald of his crimes. The broken treaties. The attacks on pilgrims. The threats against Mecca. He offered Reynald one chance: convert to Islam and be spared. Reynald refused, reportedly with an insult. Saladin drew his sword and personally struck Reynald. According to most accounts, he didn't kill him outright. His guards finished the execution. But Saladin had made his point. This was the only execution he ever performed personally, reserved for a man he considered beyond the bounds of honor or mercy. King Guy, terrified he was next, collapsed. Saladin reassured him, "Kings do not kill kings." That man's treachery and arrogance exceeded all bounds. The other captured nobles, including the Grand Masters of the Templars and Hospitallers, faced different fates. Saladin offered to ransom most nobles back to their families. But the military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, were different. They were too dangerous, too fanatical, too committed to wage eternal war against Islam. Saladin offered them conversion or death. Nearly everyone chose death. 230 Templar and Hospitaller knights were executed the day after the battle, beheaded by religious volunteers who considered it an honor to kill these warrior monks. It was calculated brutality. Saladin showed mercy to nobles who could be ransomed or neutralized politically. But the military orders, who would fight until death regardless, were eliminated. Hattin was more than a military victory. It was the destruction of Crusader military power in a single engagement. The fortresses and cities that remained had no field army to defend them. The kingdom was defenseless. Over the following 3 months, Saladin's forces swept through the Crusader states like a storm. Acre surrendered. Jaffa fell. Sidon, Beirut, Ascalon. City after city either surrendered or was taken by siege. Some garrisons were allowed to leave peacefully. Others were enslaved or killed, depending on whether they'd resisted. By September 1187, only a handful of Crusader strongholds remained. Tyre, under the brilliant defense of Conrad of Montferrat, held out. A few isolated castles still flew Christian banners. And Jerusalem, the prize, the goal, the city that had started this entire century of bloodshed. Saladin stood before its walls and prepared for the moment that would define his legacy. Jerusalem in September 1187 was a city of fear and desperate prayers. Refugees from across the kingdom had fled there, swelling the population beyond the city's capacity to feed them. The garrison was minimal. Most knights had died at Hattin. The walls were strong, built and rebuilt over centuries, but walls needed defenders and defenders needed hope. Saladin positioned his forces on September 20th. He brought siege engines, catapults, mining equipment, the full apparatus of medieval siege warfare. He could take the city by force. Everyone knew it. The only question was how much blood it would cost. Inside the walls, the Christians remembered 1099. When the First Crusade captured Jerusalem, the Crusaders had massacred the population. Muslims, Jews, Eastern Christians. Anyone who wasn't a Latin Christian was slaughtered. They killed people in the streets, in their homes, in mosques and synagogues. Christian chroniclers described blood running ankle-deep through the city. The Muslims trapped in Jerusalem in 1187 expected the same fate. Revenge, they assumed, would be total and merciless. Balian of Ibelin, one of the few Crusader lords to survive Hattin, had reached Jerusalem by breaking his oath to Saladin. He'd sworn not to bear arms again but came to the city to evacuate his family and found himself thrust into leadership of the defense. Balian negotiated with Saladin, seeking terms. Initially, Saladin refused. He declared that Jerusalem would be taken by force, that the crimes of 1099 would be avenged, that Muslim blood spilled 88 years ago demanded Muslim justice now. His emirs agreed. They wanted revenge. They wanted to show that Christian atrocities would not go unpunished. They wanted Jerusalem taken the same way the Crusaders had taken it, by the sword. But Balian made a desperate threat. If Saladin insisted on assault, the Christians would destroy everything of value. They demolished the Dome of the Rock in Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam. They'd kill every Muslim prisoner in the city. They'd slaughter their own families rather than let them be enslaved. They'd make Saladin's victory as costly and hollow as possible. It was probably a bluff. Balian likely couldn't have unified the terrified population behind such extreme measures. But it gave Saladin pause. He consulted with religious scholars. Islamic law provided clear guidance on the treatment of conquered peoples, especially al-Kitab, people of the book, meaning Christians and Jews. The Quran called for justice tempered with mercy. Wholesale slaughter violated those principles. And Saladin understood the political calculation. If he massacred Jerusalem, he'd be no better than the Crusaders he condemned. He'd lose the moral high ground. He'd give European propaganda a powerful weapon. And he'd alienate potential allies who might see him as a bloodthirsty barbarian rather than a righteous liberator. He made his decision. Jerusalem would be taken peacefully by negotiation. Every Christian inside would be allowed to leave safely if they paid a ransom, 10 dinars for a man, 5 for a woman, 1 for a child. Those who couldn't pay would become slaves, as was standard practice in medieval warfare. On October 2, 1187, 88 years to the day after the Crusader massacre, Saladin entered Jerusalem. His emirs watched carefully. Would he keep his word? Or would the sight of the city, the memory of 1099, the pressure from warriors who wanted blood, would all of that overcome his stated intentions? Saladin ordered his troops to maintain strict discipline. Looting was forbidden. Violence against civilians would be punished. The Christian holy sites, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, were to be protected and would remain open to Christian pilgrims. When some soldiers violated these orders, they were flogged publicly. The message was clear: the Sultan's word was law, and the law demanded restraint. But the ransom system created heartbreaking scenes. Poor Christians, and there were thousands, couldn't afford even the minimal 1 dinar for a child. They faced slavery or abandonment. Saladin's response revealed both his character and his political sophistication. He personally paid the ransom for thousands of poor Christians. His brother Al-Adil asked for 1,000 slaves as a gift from Saladin's share, then immediately freed them all. Religious leaders and wealthy Muslims followed suit, buying ransoms and freeing captives as acts of pious charity. European chroniclers, writing decades later, struggled with this. They were trying to portray Saladin as the enemy of Christendom, the infidel destroyer. But they couldn't deny what had happened. Even hostile Christian sources acknowledged his mercy and restraint. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, Heraclius, became a particular focus of outrage, and not from Muslims but from his own people. Heraclius paid his ransom of 10 dinars and left the city with wagons of gold and treasure from the churches. Meanwhile, thousands of poor Christians who couldn't afford ransom faced slavery. Christian chroniclers condemned Heraclius bitterly. If he'd used that treasure to pay ransoms, thousands could have been freed. Instead, he saved church wealth and abandoned his flock. Saladin could have seized that treasure. By the laws of war, it was his right. Instead, he let Heraclius go, perhaps calculating that the patriarch's greed would do more damage to Christian morale than any action Saladin could take. In the end, about 15,000 Christians were indeed enslaved, those who genuinely couldn't pay and for whom no one bought ransoms. It was a tragedy, and we shouldn't minimize their suffering. But compared to 1099, compared to what victorious medieval armies typically did, compared to what everyone expected, Saladin's treatment of Jerusalem was revolutionary. The Islamic holy sites were purified and restored. The Dome of the Rock, which had been turned into a church, was reconverted to a mosque. The crosses were removed. The Christian additions were torn down. Muslim prayers echoed again from the place where Muhammad was said to have ascended to heaven. But the Christian holy sites remained standing. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was not destroyed. Eastern Christian communities were allowed to stay if they paid the jizya, the tax non-Muslims paid under Islamic rule. Jewish communities expelled by the Crusaders were invited to return. Would you have shown mercy or chosen revenge? The question haunts us because in that moment, Saladin made a choice that defied expectations, contradicted his culture's desire for vengeance, and created a legacy that would outlast his empire. News of Jerusalem's fall reached Europe like a thunderbolt. Pope Urban III reportedly died of grief upon hearing it. Pope Gregory VIII immediately called for a new crusade. Kings and emperors began assembling the largest Crusader expedition yet, the Third Crusade. Saladin had won his greatest victory. But he'd also guaranteed that Europe's response would be massive, unified, and led by the continent's greatest warriors. The war was far from over. The Third Crusade, assembled in 1189, was the most formidable Christian military expedition since the First Crusade. 3 kings led it: Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, perhaps the most respected ruler in Europe; Philip II Augustus of France, ambitious and cunning; and Richard I of England, called Coeur de Lion, the Lionheart. Saladin had won Jerusalem, but he'd awakened a sleeping giant. Frederick Barbarossa drowned crossing a river in Anatolia before ever reaching the Holy Land, a freak accident that deprived the crusade of its most experienced leader and eliminated a substantial German force. But Richard and Philip pressed on, and they were formidable enough. The first major engagement was the Siege of Acre, a coastal city Saladin had captured. The Crusaders laid siege in 1189. Saladin counter-sieged them, surrounding the Christian besiegers. For 2 years, the situation became a brutal stalemate, a siege within a siege, with disease, starvation, and constant skirmishing grinding down both sides. Saladin threw everything he had at breaking the siege. He launched repeated attacks on the Crusader camp. He tried to resupply Acre by sea. He offered the garrison his personal guarantee that relief was coming. But the Crusaders, reinforced from Europe, held on grimly. In July 1191, Acre surrendered. The garrison negotiated terms. Their lives would be spared in exchange for a massive ransom, the return of the True Cross captured at Hattin, and the release of Christian prisoners. Saladin, watching from nearby hills, agreed to the terms. But when the ransom deadline came, there were complications. Some prisoners weren't produced. The True Cross couldn't be located. It may have been lost or deliberately hidden. The ransom payments were delayed. Richard, never a patient man, made a decision that would stain his reputation forever. On August 20, 1191, he had 2,700 Muslim prisoners, men who'd surrendered under promise of safety, marched outside Acre's walls and executed, beheaded in full view of Saladin's army. It was a calculated atrocity. Richard wanted to provoke Saladin into a rash attack. He wanted to terrorize future garrisons into surrendering immediately, and he wanted to eliminate prisoners who would slow his march south. Saladin's forces could only watch in horror as their comrades were slaughtered. The Sultan reportedly wept. His emirs demanded revenge, demanded that Christian prisoners be executed in retaliation. But Saladin refused. He understood that descending into tit-for-tat massacres would undermine everything he'd built. His reputation for mercy and honor, that was a strategic asset. Richard had shown himself capable of atrocity. Saladin would not. It's one of history's remarkable moments, the barbarian Muslim showing restraint while the civilized Christian king committed mass murder. The campaign that followed was a grueling test of wills between two of the medieval world's greatest commanders. Richard was arguably the better tactical general, more aggressive, more innovative, more willing to take risks. Saladin was the superior strategist, more patient, better at logistics, more politically sophisticated. Richard marched his army south along the coast toward Jerusalem, maintaining supply lines by sea. Saladin shadowed him, harassing his flanks, burning crops and poisoning wells in a scorched earth strategy. At Arsuf, on September 7, 1191, the two armies finally clashed in open battle. Richard had maintained his army in tight marching formation despite constant harassment, a remarkable feat of discipline. When Saladin's forces pressed too close, Richard unleashed a devastating cavalry charge that broke the Muslim lines. It was Richard's greatest tactical victory, and ultimately meaningless. Saladin's army withdrew in good order, regrouped, and continued to shadow the Crusaders. No decisive advantage was gained. Richard pushed closer to Jerusalem, coming within sight of the city's walls in January 1192. His army was exhausted, depleted by disease and casualties, but tantalizingly close to the goal. And then Richard made the hardest decision of his life. He turned back. The mathematics were brutal. Even if he took Jerusalem, and that was far from certain, he couldn't hold it. His army would have to garrison the city, maintain supply lines across hostile territory, resist Saladin's inevitable counter-siege. And Richard couldn't stay indefinitely. He had a kingdom in Europe, enemies threatening his territories, political crises demanding his attention. Taking Jerusalem would be a glorious gesture. But it would be temporary and the cost would be catastrophic. Richard retreated to the coast. His frustrated soldiers nearly mutinied. They'd come so far, sacrificed so much, gotten so close. But Richard knew that glory without sustainability was just expensive failure. The following months saw continued skirmishing. In August 1192, Saladin launched a surprise attack on Jaffa, capturing the city. Richard, with only a handful of knights and a few hundred infantry, launched a desperate counterattack. What happened next became legend. Richard and his small force defended Jaffa's beach against Saladin's entire army. The English king, fighting in the surf with a battle-axe, personally led charge after charge. His knights, vastly outnumbered, held formation with insane courage. Saladin's forces couldn't break them. The sight of Richard fighting like a man possessed, his small force refusing to yield despite impossible odds, convinced Saladin's troops they were facing something supernatural. The attack was called off. Richard held Jaffa. According to multiple sources, Saladin was so impressed that he sent Richard fresh horses as a gift, because a warrior of Richard's caliber deserved a proper mount. Richard, in return, sent Saladin rare birds and other gifts from his camp. These gestures of chivalry between mortal enemies fascinated medieval chroniclers and continue to fascinate us. In the midst of total war, two men who were trying to kill each other maintained a relationship of mutual respect. But both were exhausted. Richard's army was depleted, and news from England suggested his brother John was threatening his throne. Saladin's coalition was fraying. His emirs were tired of continuous warfare, his treasury was empty, and internal opposition to his rule was growing. In September 1192, they negotiated a 3-year truce. The terms reflected military reality. The Crusaders kept the coastal cities they'd recaptured, Acre, Jaffa, and others. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims could visit freely, unarmed and in small groups. It satisfied neither side completely, but both could claim partial success. Richard had secured Christian access to the holy sites and re-established Crusader presence on the coast. Saladin had kept Jerusalem and forced the Crusaders to accept its loss. Richard sailed for Europe in October 1192, never to return. Saladin rode back to Damascus, exhausted and ill. The two greatest warriors of their age never met face to face. But they'd fought each other to a standstill, and in doing so, created legends that would outlast their lives and their kingdoms. The Third Crusade had drained Saladin in ways that weren't immediately obvious. He was 54 years old, elderly by medieval standards, and his body bore the accumulated damage of decades of campaigning. The constant stress of holding together a fractious coalition, managing logistics for armies of tens of thousands, personally leading troops in battle, it had taken a toll. But Saladin couldn't rest. The truce with the Crusaders was temporary. His empire required constant attention. Local governors needed supervision. Religious institutions needed patronage. The complex web of alliances and obligations that held his territories together demanded his personal involvement. In February 1193, he rode out from Damascus to greet a returning pilgrim caravan. It was a simple ceremonial duty, the kind of public appearance that maintained his image as a pious, accessible ruler. The weather was cold and rainy. Saladin caught a chill. At his age, weakened by years of stress and campaigning, even a minor illness could become serious. Within days, the chill became a fever. His personal physicians, the best in the Islamic world, tried every treatment they knew. But the fever worsened. Saladin grew delirious, drifting in and out of consciousness. His sons gathered at his bedside. His brother Aladil, who'd been his right hand for decades, kept vigil. Religious scholars came to pray with him. The court, the city, the empire held its breath. On March 3, 1193, Saladin briefly regained clarity. He asked that passages from the Quran be read aloud. When the reader reached the verse, "He is God, than whom there is no other deity," part of the declaration of faith that every Muslim recites, Saladin smiled. He died moments later. According to his biographer Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad, who was present, Saladin's last expression was one of peace. When his estate was inventoried, the legend of his generosity was confirmed. His personal wealth consisted of 1 gold dinar and 47 silver dirhams. Less than 50 pieces of currency. There wasn't enough money in his personal treasury to pay for his funeral. His advisors had to take up a collection. The man who'd ruled Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia, who'd commanded armies of tens of thousands, who'd received tribute from across the Islamic world. He died with less wealth than many common merchants. He'd given it all away. To soldiers, to the poor, to religious institutions, to anyone who needed it. His funeral was held in Damascus, the city he'd made his capital. Thousands attended, soldiers who'd served under him, scholars he'd patronized, common people who'd benefited from his charity. Christian and Jewish residents of Damascus reportedly attended as well, mourning a ruler who'd treated them with relative tolerance. But the political consequences of his death were immediate and catastrophic for his vision of unity. Saladin had tried to prevent succession disputes by dividing his territories among his sons and close relatives. Al-Afdal received Damascus and Syria. Al-Aziz got Egypt. Al-Zahir took Aleppo. Smaller territories went to other family members. He'd hoped this would maintain family unity and collective strength. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Within months, his sons were fighting each other. Al-Afdal and Al-Aziz went to war over control of Damascus. Al-Adil, Saladin's brother, played the different factions against each other and eventually seized power for himself, sidelining Saladin's sons. The emirs and governors who'd submitted to Saladin's authority because of his personal prestige began acting independently. The religious legitimacy he'd carefully cultivated fragmented. The unity he'd built through 2 decades of patient diplomacy and strategic warfare dissolved in less than 2 years. The Ayyubid dynasty he founded would survive for decades, producing capable rulers like his brother Al-Adil and his nephew Al-Kamil. But it would never again achieve the unified power Saladin had wielded at his peak. The empire had been held together by one man's vision, reputation, and force of personality. Without him, the centrifugal forces that always threatened medieval Islamic politics reasserted themselves. Yet something endured beyond political power. The example. The legend. The story of what Saladin had accomplished and how he'd done it. Today, if you visit Damascus, you can find Saladin's tomb. It's a modest structure, nothing like the grand mausoleums that house other conquerors. Inside are actually 2 tombs, a marble sarcophagus added centuries later, and the original wooden one where Saladin was actually buried, simple and unadorned. That wooden tomb tells you everything about who Saladin wanted to be. Not a king lying in luxury even in death, but a servant of his faith, returning to the earth with the same simplicity he tried to live with. But his true monument isn't stone or marble. It's the impossible standard he set, that power should be tempered with justice, that victory should be pursued with honor, that even in an age of brutal religious warfare, mercy remains possible. Did he always live up to that standard? No. He ordered executions. He waged war against fellow Muslims. He enslaved thousands. He made decisions that caused immense suffering. But in the moments that mattered most, at Jerusalem, in his treatment of prisoners, in his relationship with enemies like Richard, he chose restraint over revenge. And those choices defined his legacy more powerfully than any battlefield victory. 800 years later, in a world still grappling with religious conflict, cultural division, and the ethics of warfare, Saladin's example remains provocative. Not as a model to blindly imitate, the medieval world is gone and its values aren't ours, but as a reminder that individual choices echo through history. That reputation is a form of power. That how you win matters as much as whether you win. That mercy can be strength rather than weakness. Saladin understood something many conquerors miss. Legacy isn't just what you achieve, it's how you're remembered. And you control how you're remembered by how you treat both friends and enemies in the moments when no one would blame you for cruelty. He could have massacred Jerusalem. Everyone expected it. His own troops wanted it. History would have recorded it as justified revenge for 1099. Instead, he showed restraint. And that restraint, more than any battle he won, made him legendary. If you want more epic true stories about the people who shaped our world, like this video, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who loves history. Because these stories, of flawed human beings making choices that echo through centuries, remind us what we're capable of for good and for ill. Thanks for watching. And remember, greatness isn't measured just in victories, but in the principles you refuse to abandon even when winning seems to require it. Saladin won Jerusalem. But he won history by showing mercy when mercy was unexpected. That's a lesson worth remembering.